So in these 20 chapters, it's whining, murmuring, complaining, rebellion. And actually there are 9 specific examples of the people and their rebellion against God. Hannah made this wonderful little chart. And it's interesting to see how in each one of them there's a complaint. The people have a complaint. And then there's Yahweh's response. And then there's Moses' response. And then there are the consequences. So to have all of those in this one reading, how did that strike you?
There's definitely a pattern, but I think God is always fair and just in the way that he responds. He's the least changing of all of them, right? I think the Israelites, as you watch the progression of their complaints, the first seems pretty legitimate. Like, we're hungry, we haven't had water in 3 days, and that's a little earlier, but on it goes until finally they call Egypt the land flowing with milk and honey, and you're just like, oh, I mean, as they're leaving Egypt, you know, that Egypt was supposed to be taken out of them, but it seems like that doesn't happen. So
why do you think God allows all of these tests? Takes them out of Egypt with these signs and wonders. They all see these miracles, unquestioning miracles, and they get to wilderness. What do they expect in the wilderness?
I think they didn't expect to have to travel for so long, definitely. But the testing was to prepare them, I think, their obedience for being in the promised land, maybe. What do you think? I'm not going to be interviewed.
Well, my first reaction was, because one night I just sat and had it read to me. You know how your Bible, your app will do that to you? Took 2 hours, and by the end of it, I was just in this place of saying, God, why do they keep doing this? Yeah. I understand your judgments. I understand the righteousness of your things that you're sending against them, and then, of course, the Lord said, well, where are you in this?
Yeah.
And I know that tests are sent to us to refine us, to take the Egypt out of us, as you said, to make us more like Yeshua. And I remembered as I was going through this, one of the scriptures that the Lord has repeatedly given me is in 1 Corinthians 10:12. And it's a warning that says, beware if you think these sorts of trials can never happen to you, and the failure to appropriately respond in these trials, beware lest your pride becomes your downfall. So all of these things can happen to us, and they're written for our enlightenment, and that we might not make the same mistake. Definitely. Which one hit you the hardest of these tests?
That's a good question. I think I can see how they complained about food. I think that's just a very central thing, and I like to eat. But I think, they kind of, they were worried about their livelihood. I guess they didn't know that the Lord could sustain them for longer, if need be, and that He would always provide. So I think it was hard, too, to see that they complained about the manna. I guess it was this miracle daily. And then after a while, they just hated it. They resented it. And so the Lord sent them quail, which they wanted, but it ended up being lethal in a way. So I think the food one was interesting, how all that related.
Yeah, what struck me about the quail is it says that there was so much of it that became loathsome in their mouth.
Yeah.
God says, you want something from me? I'll give it to you until you can't take any more.
Yeah.
And then you're going to ask me to take it away, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
One of the ones that I've always kind of meditated on is the one in Numbers 20 when they are in this place again in the wilderness of sin, before the rock, no water to drink. And the time they had been there before, Yahweh had said to Moses, strike the rock and it'll bring forth water. This time he says to Moses, speak to the rock and it will bring forth water. But by this point, they'd already had 7 of these tests, and Moses is like, you rebels.
Yeah.
And I can understand why he would feel that way.
Yeah.
But rather than trusting God to provide in his mercy water just by speaking to the rock, his flesh got in the way. And that's one of the things I had read recently, that is the root of every sin is selfishness. And when our mind turns to ourself, we quickly step into sin. And that's what happened to Moses and Aaron. They were thinking about themselves at that point.
And part of what you mentioned earlier in 1 Corinthians, it talks about how the rock was Christ. And so I think it's not just a rock that he hit. You know, it was symbolically, maybe we don't understand why the Lord reacted so strongly to that. But I think in that light, that makes more sense. Why?
Actually, in that teaching about Yeshua being the rock, he needed to be struck the first time. He needed to be crucified. But after he was dead and resurrected, through prayer, we speak to the rock and receive what it is. So that was one reason. And because they failed to trust Yahweh's provision in the way he said that he would do it.
Right.
So isn't that really one of the things the Lord wants us in all of our tests? Are you going to trust me?
Right.
Or are you going to try to do it yourself, the way Pastor Russ started this whole day today? You want to talk about the snakes?
Yeah, that's a good one. So in chapter 21, the people complain again, surprise. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die here in the wilderness? There's nothing to eat or drink. We hate the manna. And then Yahweh sends poisonous snakes among the people. And then they cry out to Moses. And I think it's interesting in the way that they specifically cry out to him. They said, we have sinned by speaking against Yahweh and against you. Pray to Yahweh that he will take away the snakes. To me, that sounded so much like Pharaoh. Like the way he appealed to Moses. Like, oh, I've sinned. Please pray to God. Like, you do it. This whole interceding thing. That in and of itself just struck me. And then, so Yahweh commands Moses to make a replica of this snake and put it up on a pole. The word for pole and the word for miracle in Hebrew are the same. It's our standard in miracle. It's the word nes. So that's amazing in and of itself. Obviously, the greatest miracle we see in the Bible is the lamb being raised up on the pole. And Yeshua mentions that himself in John 3:15 when he refers again to the snake as himself in a way. And then that's something else. But yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Well, the other thing you pointed out to me that I hadn't noticed before is that that serpent actually becomes a god. The people in 2 Kings are seen worshiping the serpent as a god.
Yeah.
So what was meant by the Father to be a blessing and a salvation becomes an idol.
Yeah. What do you think of the Korah rebellion in 16? Anything there?
Well, God is really serious that when he has appointed leaders or his appointed order and we come up against that, it's something that's it's an affront against him. Right. Moses didn't choose himself.
Right.
And God's appointed ones don't choose themselves. They're chosen by him.
Yeah, it says, I don't think it's here, but elsewhere, that he was the most humble man. And so that must have hurt him to think that people thought of him that way as this, controlling person or whatever. So, yeah, that was interesting too. And they were the people, the Kohathites had the highest level of leadership in the tabernacle. They were the closest, I think, to the priesthood. And so maybe that made it harder for them too.
They wanted to go even a step higher.
Yeah. And Moses gives them that opportunity, actually, when he tells the people to get the coals. They have to go and kind of act as priests for a little bit to grab those coals. And so, I thought that was interesting too.
And the fact that they used those censers that were burned up to put a covering around the altar as a permanent reminder, do not overstep the authority that the Lord has given you. And one thing, when they do the second census, those tribes that were most involved in the murmuring lose the most people. So, for example, Simeon went from the third largest to the smallest tribe. And so that's an example of not allowing the influence of people around us to draw us into that place of sin.
Yeah, Yahweh says he says, I think twice, to get away from the people who started the rebellion. And I think if you look at the camp layout, those tribes were close together. So just that proximity, the bad company corrupts good habits kind of thing. So that was interesting. And as you mentioned earlier, that the selfishness is at the center of every sin. Rebellion and pride kind of go with that. And Yahweh says to use the thingies, the incense things, as a cover for the altar. And so every time the blood was sprinkled on the altar, it was covering the rebellion, which is at the core of sin. That I thought was very interesting too. So, yeah, humbling.
Well, there's so much more in these 20 chapters. So if you want to come and join us for some more lively debate later, we welcome you.